The needle pierced the fabric with a soft whisper that was barely audible above the distant rumble of artillery, and the woman who held it kept her eyes fixed on the torn seam, because looking up meant seeing the guards, and seeing the guards meant remembering where she was and what had been taken from her. And so she focused on the thread passing through cloth, and pretended that she was still in her mother's shop in Manila, where the smell of jasmine drifted through open windows and the sound of children playing filled the streets, and not here in this place of concrete and barbed wire where hope went to die. Her name was Rosalinda Santos, and she had been 23 years old when the Japanese invaded the Philippines in December 19, and her life had been simple and good and filled with dreams of opening her own dress shop someday and marrying a young man named Eduardo who worked at his father's bakery, and having children who would grow up free and happy in a world at peace. But the bombs that fell on Manila shattered those dreams, along with the buildings and the bodies and the future she had imagined for herself. The Japanese occupation transformed the Philippines into a prison, and Rosalinda watched as her city was consumed by fear and hunger and cruelty, and she learned to walk with her eyes down and to speak only when spoken to, and to make herself as small and invisible as possible, because the soldiers who patrolled the streets took pleasure in punishing those who showed any sign of defiance. And the stories of what happened to young women who caught their attention spread through whispers that made sleep impossible. But what happened next changed everything, because in the chaos of the occupation, Rosalinda's father joined the resistance, and he used their small seamstress shop as a meeting place for guerrillas who were gathering intelligence and planning sabotage against the Japanese forces, and Rosalinda became part of the network without ever consciously choosing to, because when your father asks you to carry a message hidden in the lining of a dress, you do not refuse, you simply sew and walk and pray that no one searches too carefully. The information she carried helped the resistance coordinate with American forces, who were planning the eventual liberation of the islands, and she passed through checkpoints with her sewing basket on her arm and her heart pounding so loudly that she was certain the guards could hear it, and she smiled when they asked her business and told them she was delivering a dress to a customer, and they waved her through because she was just a seamstress, and seamstresses were harmless and invisible, and that invisibility saved her life until the day it didn't. Yet she never imagined this moment would reshape her destiny, because in February 1944, someone in the resistance network was captured and tortured and gave up names and addresses, and the Japanese came to the shop at 3 in the morning and dragged Rosalinda and her father into the street, and her mother screamed until a rifle but silenced her. And Eduardo, who'd been sleeping in a back room, was shot when he tried to intervene, and Rosalinda watched him fall and felt something inside her chest cracked like glass, breaking in slow motion. They took her to Fort Santiago, the old Spanish fortress that the Japanese had converted into a prison and interrogation center, and the walls of that place had witnessed centuries of suffering, but nothing compared to what happened there during the occupation. Rosalinda was thrown into a cell with 15 other women, and the floor was wet with things she did not want to identify, and the smell was so overwhelming that she vomited until there was nothing left inside her. The interrogations lasted for weeks, and they wanted to know everything about the resistance network and the names of the guerrilla leaders and the locations of their camps, and Rosalinda told them nothing because telling meant betraying people who trusted her. And betraying people who trusted her was worse than any pain they could inflict, and they hurt her in ways that she would never speak of, and left scars on her body that would never fully heal, but they did not break her, because some things are stronger than flesh and bone. And then something no one expected, because one of the Japanese officers noticed the quality of the stitching on her dress and asked where she had learned to sew. And she told him about her mother's shop and the years of training and the satisfaction of creating something beautiful from simple cloth. And he looked at her for a long moment, and then he told the guards to clean her up because the camp commandant's wife needed someone to repair her husband's uniforms. She was transferred to a different section of the prison where conditions were marginally better, and given a needle and thread and a pile of torn military uniforms, and told that her life depended on the quality of her work, and Rosalinda understood that she had been given a chance to survive. And she took that chance, and she sewed with a precision and care that amazed even herself, because every stitch was a declaration that she would not die in this place, and that the Japanese would not take everything from her. Behind these ruins a secret waited, because as Rosalinda mended uniforms, she began to pay attention to the conversations around her, and she noticed things that the guards assumed she could not understand, and she saw documents lying on tables and heard plans being discussed, and she realized that her position gave her access to information that the resistance desperately needed, and she began to memorize everything she saw and heard and tucked that information away in her mind like threads she would weave together later. The commandant's wife was a woman named Haruki, who had followed her husband to the Philippines and who hated the heat and the humidity and the constant fear of guerrilla attacks, and she treated Rosalinda with casual cruelty interspersed with moments of surprising kindness, and Rosalinda learned to read her moods and to make herself useful in ways that went beyond sewing, and she became a fixture in the household. Invisible and indispensable, and always listening, always watching, always remembering. What she discovered next would shake even her commanders, because Rosalinda overheard a conversation between the commandant and a visiting general about a planned offensive against the American forces who were advancing toward the Philippines, and she heard dates and troop numbers and locations, and she knew that this information could save thousands of American lives if only she could get it to someone who could use it. But she was a prisoner, and the walls around her were high, and the guards were vigilant, and escape seemed impossible. She found a way through the laundry, because the women who washed the officers' clothes were also prisoners, and among them was a woman named Consuelo, who had connections to the outside, and Rosalinda whispered what she had learned while they worked side by side in the steam and the soap, and Consuelo nodded and said nothing, and 3 days later, Rosalinda saw her being led away by guards, and she never saw her again, but she heard later that the information had reached the resistance, and that the American commanders had adjusted their plans accordingly. The months that followed were a delicate dance of survival and espionage, and Rosalinda continued to sew and to listen and to pass information whenever she could, and she never knew if her contributions made a difference, because the war was so vast and she was so small, but she kept trying because trying was all she had left, and because Eduardo had died believing in a future worth fighting for, and she owed it to his memory to keep fighting even if her weapons were only needles and thread. The other prisoners looked to her for hope, and she gave them what she could, and she taught them too. So when the guards allowed it, and she told them stories at night, when the darkness made everything worse, and she held them when they cried, and she cried with them when the grief became too heavy to carry alone, and she became a mother to some, and a sister to others, and a friend to all who needed one, and the bonds she formed in that prison would last longer than the walls that held them. Liberation came in February 1945, when American forces finally reached Manila, and the battle for the city was one of the bloodiest of the Pacific War, and Rosalinda heard the explosions and the gunfire, and she knew that rescue was close, but she also knew that the Japanese were killing prisoners rather than allowing them to be freed, and she organized the women in her section, and they barricaded their cell, and they waited in the darkness, and they prayed to every god they could name. The Americans found them 3 days later, and the soldier who opened their cell door was a young man from Kansas who'd never seen anything like what he saw in that prison, and he wept as he helped him out, and Rosalinda thanked him in English that she had learned from American movies before the war, and he gave her his canteen, and she drank clean water for the first time in months, and the taste was so sweet that she thought she might be dreaming. But the Liberationist brought its own horrors, because when Rosalinda returned to what had been her neighborhood, she found only rubble and ash, and the bodies of people she had known her entire life, and her mother was among them, killed in the crossfire between Japanese and American forces, and her father had died in prison months earlier, though she only learned this now, and she stood in the ruins of her childhood home, and she felt nothing at all, because there was nothing left inside her to feel. The months after the war were harder in some ways than the war itself, because at least during the occupation, she had known what she was fighting against, and now she had to learn how to live again and how to build something from nothing, and how to carry the weight of everything she had lost without collapsing under its burden, and she discovered that survival was not a single act of courage, but 1,000 small choices made every day to keep breathing and keep moving forward. She rebuilt her mother's shop with her own hands, and she hired other women who had survived the prison camps, and together they created a business that was more than a business. It was a sanctuary and a statement and a defiance of everything the war had tried to take from them, and the dresses they made were beautiful, and the customers who wore them carried a piece of that defiance with them, and Rosalinda found a purpose that gave meaning to her survival. The American military invited her to testify about conditions in the prison camps, and she traveled to Manila and then to Tokyo, and she sat in courtrooms and told stories that made hardened soldiers look away, and she pointed at men who had tortured her and watched as they were sentenced, and she felt no satisfaction, only exhaustion, and a desperate wish that none of it had ever happened, and that Eduardo was waiting for her at home with flour on his hands and love in his eyes. She never married because Eduardo had been the love of her life, and she could not imagine giving her heart to anyone else. and she poured all of her love into her work and her employees and the children of her neighborhood who called her Tita Rosa and came to her shop after school for cookies and sewing lessons and stories about a time before they were born when the world had been very dark, but some people had found ways to shine. The years turned into decades, and Rosalinda became a small figure in the history of the war, one name among millions, and she was honored by the Philippine government and by American veterans, organizations, and by historians who recognized the importance of the intelligence she had gathered, and she accepted these honors with grace, but she always said that she had only done what anyone would have done, and that the real heroes were the ones who had not survived. Her hands began to shake as she grew older, and the eyes that had once threaded needles in darkness needed glasses, and then stronger glasses, and then magnifying lamps, and still she sewed because sewing was who she was and who she had always been, and she trained a generation of seamstresses who carried her techniques and her standards and her insistence that every stitch be perfect, because perfection was not about pride, it was about respect for the work and for the person who would wear it. She passed away in 1998 at the age of 80, and her funeral was attended by hundreds of people who had known her and loved her and been changed by her, and the American ambassador to the Philippines sent a wreath and a letter that described her contributions to the war effort, and the letter was read aloud at the service. And many people were surprised because Rosalinda had never talked about those days and had never sought recognition for what she had done. The shop she built still stands on a quiet street in Manila, and her great-niece runs it now, and the sign above the door bears her name, and inside there is a photograph of a young woman with dark eyes and steady hands, and the caption beneath it reads, Rosalinda Santos, seamstress, survivor. Heroine visitors sometimes stop and ask about her, and the story they hear is the story that Rosalinda herself rarely told, because she believed that the best way to honor the past was to live fully in the present. Her legacy is sewn into the fabric of a nation that survived one of the most brutal occupations in history, and her example proves that resistance takes many forms, and that courage is not always loud, and that the smallest actions can ripple outward in ways that change the course of history. And Rosalinda Santos was just a seamstress who repaired uniforms to survive, but she was also a spy and a survivor and a symbol of everything that could not be destroyed. The needle she used in the prison camp was preserved by one of the women she saved, and it now rests in a museum in Manila, behind glass, in a case, and visitors look at it and try to imagine how something so small could have been so important. And the answer is that it was not the needle that mattered. It was the hand that held it, and the heart that guided it, and the refusal to surrender that made every stitch an act of defiance. And so we remember Rosalinda Santos not as a victim of war, but as a victor over circumstances that should have destroyed her, and we remember her not because she sought glory, but because she sought only to survive, and in surviving, she saved others, and in saving others she proved that human dignity cannot be conquered, no matter how hard the conquerors try, and her story will be told as long as there are people who believe that one person can make a difference. The thread she used has long since rotted away, and the uniform she repaired have been reduced to dust, and the prison where she suffered has been torn down and replaced by a park where children play. But the memory of what happened there remains, and Rosalinda's spirit remains, and the lesson she taught with every stitch she made remains. And that lesson is simple and profound and eternal. And it is this, that even in the darkest places light can be found if you have the courage to look for it. She sewed to survive, and in sewing she saved not only herself, but the memory of everyone who did not survive, and she carried their stories in every thread and every seam and every perfectly pressed collar. And when she finally laid down her needle, she knew that her work was complete, and that she had done what she was meant to do, and that the world was a little bit better because she had passed through it with her eyes open and her hands steady and her heart unbroken.